May the spirits guide and protect us through this sacred ritual.
What if the real treasures of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan were not in their monuments, but in their hidden spiritual roots? The world has long been fascinated by the pyramids, the towering obelisks, the painted tombs, and the golden treasures unearthed from the sands. Yet what if these were only surface symbols? Faint reflections of something deeper, a wisdom carried not in stone, but in spirit. What if beneath the hieroglyphs and carved walls lay a philosophy so profound that it shaped entire civilizations, yet remained hidden from the gaze of history books? When people think of Egypt, their minds turn to pharaohs and mummies. When Ethiopia is remembered, it is through the lens of Christianity and empire. Sudan, often overshadowed, is framed only by its deserts and struggles. But the question remains, what lies beyond these familiar images? What hidden cosmologies pulsed beneath the surface? What metaphysical sciences were practiced that the modern world has forgotten? These lands were not only political kingdoms, they were spiritual laboratories, places where the mysteries of existence were tested, explored, and encoded into culture. Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan are bound by mud and geography. The Nile flows like an artery through their histories, carrying water and memory from the mountains of Ethiopia to the delta of Egypt. Along its banks rose temples, shrines, and communities that viewed life itself as sacred theater. Every sunrise a rebirth, every flood a divine rhythm, every word a vibration of power. The monuments we marvel at today were never meant as static stone. They were living texts, cosmic diagrams of truths that guided entire peoples in their pursuit of balance with the universe. Yet colonization, conquest, and dogma buried much of this wisdom. Egypt was recast as a civilization divorced from its African roots. Ethiopia's indigenous philosophies were overshadowed by imported narratives. Sudan's Nubian legacy was reduced to footnotes, its spiritual contributions all but erased. But if we look beyond the rubble and the rewritten histories, we begin to glimpse something greater, a shared metaphysical heritage that saw the visible and invisible as one continuum, and that understood life not as a random struggle, but as a sacred journey bound to cosmic law. This is the story hidden beneath the pyramids, the scriptures, and the ruins. It is the story of Africa's spiritual roots in the Nile Valley, roots that still whisper across time, waiting to be uncovered.
O great spirits of our ancestors, hear our prayers and guide us.
To most of the world, Egypt is a civilization of pyramids, temples, and kings who called themselves pharaohs. Yet these monuments were never merely political statements of power or extravagant tombs for the dead. They were the outward faces of a hidden spiritual science, a system that sought to align the human being with the cosmic order. Egypt was first and foremost a metaphysical civilization, and its greatness was not measured only in stone, but in how it translated the invisible laws of the universe into a living culture. At the heart of this science was the principle of Ma'at. More than a goddess, Ma'at represented truth, balance, justice, and harmony with the cosmos. To live outside Ma'at was to invite chaos, both personally and collectively. Pharaohs swore oaths to uphold her order, and ordinary farmers invoked her principles in daily dealings. The weighing of the heart against Ma'at's feather in the afterlife was more than myth. It was a reminder that the soul itself was bound to universal law. In this way, Egypt built its entire society around a spiritual ethic where morality was inseparable from cosmic science. This vision of balance and cosmic order was expressed in layers of symbolism. Every temple was a diagram of the universe, every ritual a reenactment of creation, every statue a coded text of hidden meaning. The pyramid itself, rising from the desert sands, was not only a tomb, but a geometric meditation, a structure aligned with the stars and infused with mathematical precision. Its shape pointed upward, a reminder that human existence was a journey toward the higher realms. Sacred geometry was more than art. It was a language of spirit, teaching through stone what words could not fully express. Within this world, the priests served as custodians of knowledge. They were not simply religious officials, but initiates trained in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and spiritual law. Their role was to guard and transmit wisdom through carefully structured initiations. To be initiated was not only to learn, but to be transformed, to pass through trials that stripped away ignorance and revealed hidden truths. These initiations, conducted in the hidden chambers of temples, were the true heart of Egypt's power, producing individuals capable of holding the balance of Ma'at in their own lives and guiding others into harmony with the cosmos. The language of hieroglyphs was also part of this spiritual science. Each symbol was more than a letter or word. It was a living vibration, a doorway into power. The Egyptians believed that to name something was to give it life, and that words, when inscribed in sacred forms, could influence reality. Hieroglyphs were the meeting point of art, sound, and metaphysics. They encoded not only language but layers of meaning, each sign resonating with spiritual significance. To master hieroglyphs was to wield the creative force of the universe itself. Egypt's spiritual sciences did not exist in isolation. They were part of a wider African metaphysical continuum, reflecting ideas shared across the continent. The concept of Ma'at, with its emphasis on truth and balance, resonates with the Igbo idea of Ofo and Ogu, or the Yoruba concept of Iwa, where character and morality align with cosmic order. The role of priests as mediators between spirit and society finds echoes in the diviners, herbalists, and custodians of sacred knowledge across African cultures. Even the use of symbolic language and sound recalls the power of incantations and chants in countless African traditions. This connection is not coincidental. Egypt was nourished by the Nile, whose waters flowed from the highlands of East Africa, carrying not only life, but cultural memory. Ethiopia, Sudan, and other lands along the Nile were part of the same spiritual ecosystem. The flow of people, rituals, and knowledge created a continuity that colonial narratives later sought to break. When we restore Egypt to its African context, we see that its greatness was not an anomaly, but a flowering of deeper traditions rooted in the continent's soil. What makes Egypt's hidden spiritual sciences so enduring is their relevance beyond history. They remind us that knowledge is not merely information but transformation, that symbols and rituals are technologies of the spirit, and that true civilization is built not only on material wealth but on harmony with cosmic law. Egypt's priests, architects, and scribes were less concerned with conquest than with alignment, with ensuring that each temple, each festival, and each law reflected the eternal order of the universe. When we strip away the myths imposed by outsiders, we see Egypt not only as a land of wonders, but as a school of spirit, where geometry taught truth, where words shaped reality, and where every act of life was measured against the balance of Ma'at. This was its hidden power, its true legacy, and its gift to the wider African world.
May the spirits guide and protect us through this sacred ritual.
Ethiopia stands as one of the most remarkable bridges of African spiritual continuity, a land where the ancient and the modern walk hand in hand. To speak of Ethiopia is to speak of a civilization that has carried sacred traditions for millennia, sheltering them from erasure even as empires rose and fell around it. While the world often remembers Ethiopia for its Christian heritage, The roots of its spirituality extend far deeper into Cushitic traditions that predate organized religion and into rituals that still echo with the voice of Africa's ancestral wisdom. The Cushitic peoples, among the oldest inhabitants of the Horn of Africa, left a profound spiritual imprint that still resonates. Their cosmologies were grounded in the rhythms of nature and the presence of ancestors, honoring the forces that shaped life and death. Rituals involving cattle, fire, and water reflected a worldview where elements of the earth were portals to the divine. This legacy did not vanish with the passage of time. Instead, it was woven into the spiritual fabric of Ethiopia, surviving through adaptation, integration, and continuity. The songs sung in rural rituals, the chants performed during seasonal cycles, and the invocations to ancestors all reveal that beneath Ethiopia's surface lies an ancient Cushitic soul. Ethiopia's role as a spiritual bridge is unmatched. Unlike many regions where colonialism sought to sever ties with indigenous traditions, Ethiopia maintained sovereignty and preserved much of its heritage. Its spiritual memory stretches back not only through its own history, but through its connection to the Nile Valley civilizations. The highlands of Ethiopia, where the Nile begins, were seen as sacred sources of life, places where water flowed not only to nourish the land, but to carry the memory of creation itself. In this way, Ethiopia linked the southern roots of Africa with the northern flowering of Egypt, binding the continent in a shared spiritual current. Even with the rise of Christianity, Ethiopia never abandoned its indigenous metaphysics. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, absorbed and preserved many of these earlier practices. Its chants, drumming, incense rituals, and processions are not simply religious performances but echoes of older African ceremonies. The veneration of saints parallels the older veneration of ancestors, while the emphasis on fasting and ritual purification reflects long-standing indigenous practices of spiritual discipline. Beneath the surface of Christianity lies a continuity of Africa's oldest metaphysical traditions, encoded in ways that ensured survival across centuries. Sacred mountains also form part of this spiritual landscape. Ethiopia's geography is dominated by highlands and peaks, many of which are revered as places where heaven and earth meet. Monks retreated to these mountains to seek visions, to live in silence, and to commune with forces beyond the human world. Such mountains were not merely geographic features but cosmic altars, sanctuaries where prayers could rise more directly to the divine. Even today, pilgrims climb to mountaintop monasteries, carrying with them the same faith that their ancestors carried when they sought the presence of the unseen in the heights of the land. The monastic tradition of Ethiopia further reveals its role as a keeper of cosmic wisdom. Monks withdrew from society not out of rejection, but to preserve a spiritual fire that could not be extinguished. Through fasting, chanting, and meditation, they became living vessels of continuity, transmitting knowledge through oral teachings and ritual practice. The monasteries became archives of both scripture and tradition, storing manuscripts that carried not only Christian theology but also cosmological reflections rooted in Africa's metaphysical vision. Within these sacred spaces, the line between indigenous wisdom and adopted faith blurred, producing a uniquely Ethiopian spirituality that stands as a testament to resilience. Cosmic rituals also mark Ethiopia's continuity with the deeper African spiritual world. Festivals that align with solar and lunar cycles reveal an understanding of time as sacred rhythm, not mere chronology. The celebration of Timkat, commemorating the baptism of Christ, also echoes older water rituals tied to fertility, cleansing, and renewal. The lighting of fires during Meskel recalls fire traditions rooted in Cushitic cosmology. Each ritual reveals how Ethiopia carried forward ancient wisdom, cloaking it in new forms but never severing it from its original roots. What makes Ethiopia's spiritual continuity especially powerful is its ability to inspire beyond its borders. For the African diaspora, Ethiopia became a symbol of resilience, the land that was never colonized, the keeper of an unbroken thread of heritage. For Pan-African thinkers, it became proof that African traditions could withstand the weight of history. And for spiritual seekers worldwide, Ethiopia remains a beacon, a place where the ancient and the eternal are not confined to ruins but are alive in ritual, chant, and daily practice. Ethiopia's story is not one of rupture but of weaving. Ancient Cushitic traditions survived by interlacing themselves into new forms, creating a continuity that defied conquest, colonization, and time itself. Its mountains, monasteries, chants, and festivals speak not only to Ethiopia's people, but to the entire African world. They remind us that Africa's spiritual roots are not relics of the past, but living streams that continue to flow, nourishing those who are ready to listen. Ethiopia, in this sense, is not just a nation, but a sanctuary of memory, carrying the hidden flame of Africa's spiritual heritage into the present and beyond.
May the spirits guide and protect us through this sacred ritual.
Sudan, lying at the heart of the Nile Valley, carries a mystical legacy that is too often hidden beneath layers of silence, neglect, and distortion. While Egypt is celebrated for its monumental architecture and Ethiopia for its unbroken spiritual continuity, Sudan remains obscured, though it once stood as a vital center of African cosmology. Ancient Nubia and the Kingdom of Kush thrived here, and their spiritual traditions shaped not only their own societies but also influenced the wider Nile Valley. To speak of Sudan is to uncover a missing chapter of Africa's sacred history, one that continues to whisper through ruins, oral memory, and forgotten rituals. The cosmologies of Nubia and Kush were deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature and the cycles of the cosmos. The sun, rising over the eastern horizon of the Nile, was not merely a source of light, but a divine force embodying creation and renewal. The stars above, meticulously charted by Nubian priests, served as maps of destiny, guiding rituals and agricultural cycles. Deities were not distant figures, but living presences bound to rivers, mountains, and the ancestral lineages of the people. This worldview presented the universe as an interconnected whole, where the visible and invisible worlds were woven into one seamless fabric. These cosmologies were not confined to abstract philosophy. They found expression in the sacred architecture of Nubia and Kush. The pyramids of Meroe, smaller but more numerous than those of Egypt, were not simply tombs but cosmic beacons. Each structure was aligned to celestial patterns, marking the relationship between the earthly and the divine. Temples dedicated to Amun, Isis, and other deities were not borrowed imitations of Egyptian religion, but unique adaptations that reflected Sudanese visions of spirit and power. They show us that Sudan was not a passive receiver of ideas, but an active contributor to the spiritual vocabulary of the Nile Valley. Sudan also played a crucial role in transmitting spiritual knowledge along the length of the Nile. The river did not only carry goods and people, it carried stories, rituals, and metaphysical sciences. Nubian priests traveled between kingdoms, sharing sacred songs and ceremonies. Warriors bore charms consecrated by Cushitic traditions. Traders carried not only gold and ivory, but also the language of spirit, ensuring that the beliefs of one community resonated far beyond its borders. In this way, Sudan became a bridge of ideas, shaping both the grandeur of Egypt to the north and the sacred continuity of Ethiopia to the south. Mystical practices flourished in this environment,
offering ways for individuals and communities to commune with unseen forces. Ancestral veneration formed the cornerstone of Sudanese spirituality. The dead were never thought of as gone. They were guardians who continued to guide the living. Families poured libations, sang songs, and called upon their ancestors in times of crisis. This reverence extended into national rituals, where kings were crowned not only with political authority, but with the blessing of ancestral spirits who anchored the kingdom in legitimacy and cosmic order. Alongside ancestor veneration, Sudan preserved a tradition of sacred divination. Priests and seers read patterns in water, fire, and stars, interpreting them as messages from the divine. These practices were not superstitions but precise systems of knowledge, honed across centuries of observation and reflection. They guided decisions in agriculture, governance, and war, ensuring that human actions remained aligned with cosmic forces. The rituals of healing too drew upon this mystical heritage, combining herbs, chants, and the invocation of spirit to restore balance in body and community alike. Yet much of this legacy was deliberately erased by colonial narratives. European archaeologists, encountering the ruins of Nubia and Meroe, often describe them as imitations of Egypt, denying Sudan its originality. Colonial administrators dismissed local rituals as primitive, undermining the depth of Sudan's cosmologies. Textbooks ignored Kush altogether or reduced it to a footnote in Egyptian history. In doing so, they buried a civilization that had once rivaled Egypt in power and surpassed it in certain cultural achievements. The silence around Sudan's mystical legacy is not accidental. It is the result of systematic erasure. Despite this suppression, fragments of Sudan's spiritual memory remain. In the songs of Nubian villages, echoes of ancient chants can still be heard. In the shrines scattered across the land, offerings to ancestors continue in quiet defiance of imposed religions. The pyramids of Meroe still rise in the desert, mute but enduring witnesses to a time when Sudan was a spiritual powerhouse. Oral traditions passed down through families preserve myths of creation, tales of gods and ancestors, and rituals of power that survive beneath the surface of official narratives. To rediscover Sudan's mystical heritage is to restore balance to the story of Africa. Without Sudan, the Nile Valley narrative is incomplete, missing a vital voice in the chorus of African spirituality. Sudan shows us that the wisdom of the continent was not isolated in Egypt or Ethiopia alone, but flourished across regions connected by rivers, stars, and memory. It reminds us that Africa's sacred history was vast, diverse, and interconnected, defying the boundaries imposed by later maps and colonial categories. Sudan's forgotten mystical legacy calls us to listen again. To the desert winds that whisper over abandoned temples, to the pyramids that align with constellations, to the elders who still remember prayers once spoken to the ancestors. It invites us to see beyond the silence and to recognize that the spirit of Kush and Nubia is not dead, but waiting, ready to rejoin Africa's living memory of its own spiritual power. In uncovering it, we not only honor the past but reclaim the hidden continuity of Africa's metaphysical soul.
O great spirits of our ancestors, hear our prayers and guide us.
The Nile is often celebrated as the lifeline of civilizations, the river that sustained Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan with its waters and fertile banks. Yet to reduce it to a source of irrigation is to miss its deeper role. For the peoples who lived along its course, the Nile was more than geography. It was a sacred artery, a river of spirit that bound together nations, cultures, and cosmologies. Its flow was read not only as a natural event but as a divine rhythm, a pulse of the cosmos made visible upon the earth. In its waters, the ancestors saw life, death, and renewal written in eternal motion. Water has always carried profound symbolism in African thought. It is the element of fertility, the womb of creation, and the source of purification. The annual flooding of the Nile was not merely a hydrological phenomenon, but a cosmic drama. The land's barrenness giving way to life, mirroring the cycles of death and rebirth that governed the universe. The floodwaters deposited rich soil upon the banks, ensuring survival. But they also deposited meaning, reminders that creation itself was an endless cycle, and that humans were participants in a larger cosmic order. To honor the Nile was to honor the very principle of continuity. Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan each inscribed the Nile into their spiritual memory, interpreting its flow through their own traditions while recognizing its shared sacredness. In Egypt, the inundation was linked to the tears of Isis, mourning her beloved Osiris, and through her grief, bringing new life to the earth. The river became a metaphor for the eternal struggle between order and chaos, a stage upon which the balance of Ma'at was renewed each year. Rituals accompanied the flooding, ensuring that the people's gratitude was matched with reverence for the divine forces guiding the waters. In Ethiopia, the Blue Nile was revered as a fountain of life, flowing from the highlands as though descending from the heavens themselves. Its source at Lake Tana became a site of myth and pilgrimage, a reminder that water flows from the sacred into the worldly. Ethiopian rituals surrounding water, whether in Christian ceremonies like Timkat or in older Cushitic traditions of fertility and cleansing, all carried echoes of the river's sacred role. In every drop was the memory of origin, the connection between earth and sky, between people and the unseen. Sudan too carried the Nile into its cosmologies. The kingdom of Kush and later Nubian societies tied their spiritual life to the river, aligning temples with its flow and integrating its rhythms into their rituals. The pyramids of Meroe, standing close to its banks, were not simply royal tombs, but cosmic beacons, pointing toward the river as both physical sustainer and spiritual pathway. To die near the Nile was to remain close to the artery of renewal, ensuring that the spirit continued its journey along the currents that bound life and afterlife together. The Nile thus acted as a connector of memory, carrying not only water but meaning from south to north, from Ethiopia's mountains to Egypt's delta. It was the road upon which goods traveled, but also the channel through which spiritual ideas moved. Songs sung in Nubian villages could echo in Egyptian rituals. Cosmologies born in Kush could find a new life in Ethiopian ceremonies. The river erased boundaries, creating a shared spiritual ecosystem that defied the divisions later imposed by colonial maps. It is no exaggeration to say that the Nile itself was the first teacher, the sacred text upon which African civilizations wrote their wisdom. Beyond its local importance, the Nile symbolized cosmic order. Its steady flow from source to sea mirrored the journey of the soul from birth to death to rebirth. Its floods echoed the cycles of creation, destruction, and the renewal that shaped African metaphysics. Its very existence testified to the interdependence of all things. The rains in Ethiopia determining the harvests in Egypt, the fertility of Sudan feeding the prosperity of kingdoms far downstream. To harm one part of the Nile was to disturb the balance of the whole, a truth reflected in spiritual teachings that emphasized harmony, gratitude, and reverence for nature. This symbolism extended into ritual practice. Libations of water poured in ceremonies were not abstract offerings but symbolic gestures that mirrored the Nile's gift to humanity. To pour water for ancestors was to invite them to drink from the same source that sustained the living, reinforcing the bond between the seen and unseen. To immerse oneself in the river was to participate in a cosmic cleansing, aligning body and soul with the eternal cycles of creation. The Nile was not only outside the human, it flowed within, reminding each person that they too were part of the great current of life. Colonial narratives often stripped the Nile of its sacredness, reducing it to an economic resource or a strategic prize. But for those who lived along its banks, the river never ceased to be holy. Even today, rituals tied to the Nile persist, from pilgrimages to its source in Ethiopia to the prayers of farmers in Egypt who depend on its flow. The river remains a living memory, a witness to civilizations long past, and a reminder that Africa's spiritual heritage was always rooted in the elements of creation itself. To see the Nile only as a river is to miss its essence. It was and remains a cosmic connector, a spiritual artery that bound Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan into one living organism of culture and wisdom. In its waters are reflections of stars, ancestors, and gods. In its flow is the story of Africa's unbroken search for harmony with the cosmos. The Nile teaches us that geography can be sacred, that rivers can carry memory, and that when people walk in rhythm with the natural world, they align themselves with the eternal.
May the spirits guide and protect us through this sacred ritual.
O great spirits of our ancestors, hear our prayers and guide us.
As the Nile Valley civilizations gave way to new empires, and as foreign powers expanded into Africa, the spiritual sciences of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan faced deliberate attempts at erasure. Colonization arrived with its own narratives, casting African cosmologies as superstition and its rituals as backward practices. Missionaries preached against ancestral veneration, and colonial schools dismissed indigenous knowledge systems as obstacles to progress. The ancient symbols of Ma'at, the chants of Ethiopian mountains, and the shrines of Nubia were either demonized or ignored, reduced to curiosities in museums instead of living philosophies. Modern religions added another layer of suppression. Christianity and Islam, though profoundly influential in their own right, often positioned themselves as replacements for older traditions rather than their continuations. In many cases, African spiritual practices were driven underground, surviving only in whispers, in the secrecy of families, or in rituals disguised within new religious frameworks. The sacred power of water, fire, and ancestral invocation was repackaged into new liturgies, but its essence persisted. Even as colonial narratives sought to sever Africa from its spiritual roots, the memory of those roots refused to die. Traces of this continuity survive everywhere. In rural communities along the Nile, farmers still pour libations to ancestors before planting, echoing ceremonies that predate written history. Ethiopian Orthodox chants preserve the rhythms of older Cushitic rituals, while Sudanese oral traditions carry fragments of Nubian cosmology in proverbs and songs. Even the pyramids, temples, and sacred landscapes stand as silent testaments, refusing to be erased despite centuries of neglect. These are not relics of superstition, but living reminders that Africa's wisdom endures, encoded in culture, memory, and landscape. The survival of this heritage proves a deeper truth. Africa's spiritual continuity is unbreakable. Despite conquests, colonization, and suppression, the metaphysical philosophies of the continent remain woven into its people. They live in the way communities honor truth and justice, in the symbolism of rituals, and in the resilience of memory itself. What was once hidden is resurfacing,
as Africans and the diaspora reclaimed the knowledge that was denied to them. The suppression of indigenous wisdom was fierce, but the spirit of Africa was fiercer, and it continues to speak through every song, every ritual, and every story that has outlived the chains of erasure.
O great spirits of our ancestors, hear our prayers and guide us.
May the spirits guide and protect us through this sacred ritual.
The hidden roots of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan reveal that Africa's greatness was never limited to monuments of stone or conquests of kings. Its true treasures lie in the philosophies, sciences, and cosmic visions that guided entire civilizations. These societies understood the universe not as a random accident, but as an ordered, living reality in which humans, nature, and the divine were inseparably bound. To rediscover these roots is to recognize that Africa's wisdom is not a relic of the past, but a reservoir of knowledge that still holds relevance for the present and the future. In these roots, we see philosophy expressed through Ma'at's balance of truth and justice, science encoded in sacred geometry and astronomy, and cosmic vision alive in the rituals of ancestors and the symbolism of rivers and stars. This was knowledge not for a few elites, but for entire communities, shaping daily life and reminding each person that existence was sacred. When colonization tried to erase these systems, it failed to extinguish them, because what is written into the rhythm of nature and carried in the soul of a people cannot be destroyed. The task before us today is not only to admire what remains, but to reclaim it. The Nile Valley wisdom that once aligned kingdoms with the cosmos can guide us in healing the fractures of our own age. It invites us to see truth as a weapon stronger than steel, community as a shield against chaos, and spirit as the foundation of real power. To reclaim this knowledge is to restore balance, to remember that Africa's story is not one of loss, but of endurance, resilience, and renewal. If this awakens something in you, subscribe to History Store for more journeys into the wisdom of Africa's ancestors. Like this video if you believe that hidden truths deserve to be uncovered, and share it so that others may walk with us in remembering. Together we can keep alive the flame of Africa's spiritual heritage, a light that no empire, no conquest, and no erasure has ever been able to extinguish.
O great spirits of our ancestors, hear our prayers and guide us.
May the spirits guide and protect us through this sacred ritual.